The battle began on July 1, 1916 and ended on November 18, 1916, where they fought in northern France, next to the Somme River. For 5 months, British and their allies who were Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, and Italy fought against the German Empire. The Germans had much better defense strategies with their barbed wire, deep-dug trenches, and multiple backup plans. Unlike the British, who only had one attack plan which failed. Overall being one of the bloodiest military battles in history.
Why was the first day of the Battle of the Somme a disaster? The first day of the Battle of the Somme is known as the bloodiest day of the battle. The British Army suffered 57,400 casualties on the first day alone, and the German Army suffered an estimate of 6,000 casualties. One of the reasons why the first day was such a disaster is because the British Army did not have a good plan. They believed that an artillery bombardment would be enough to destroy Germans' trenches and kill many of their soldiers. The British were wrong, and the Germans had made their trenches strong enough to keep them safe. After the bombardment, the British sent off 100,000 soldiers into no man's land, thinking the bombs had killed many of the German soldiers. The British soldiers on the front lines were quickly taken down by the Germans by machine guns and artillery fire. The British were only equipped with rifles and were no match against Germany's army.
After an 8-day British bombardment, which Haig thought would destroy the German forward defences, the attack began. British soldiers moved across no man's land on the 1st of July at 7:30 in the morning. They were soon hit by machine guns and explosive shells as they progressed towards the German line. The advance was then halted because of barbed wire and heavily defended trenches. General Falluet and the French 6th Army did well in the south, but the British Army suffered appalling heavy losses.
Another reason why the first day was a disaster was because the British underestimated the Germans. The British were very sure they would be the winners of the battle, and they even started planning victory before the battle even started. The British spent very little time preparing their trenches, while the Germans spent a lot of time making their trenches sturdy, making sure they would control flooding, and they also had telephone lines for communication. All of this came as a surprise to the British Army, and it threw them off guard. So what happened to the German Army? The German Army had struggles on the first day as well. They lost their territory within the first few hours of battle when the British troops broke through their lines. But the British did not have enough reinforcements to push forward, and the Germans had enough time to regroup, and they eventually recovered lost ground. Another reason why the first day was a disaster was because the British had very little strategy. They had no alternative plan for if the bombardment was unsuccessful, while the Germans were very well prepared as they had barbed wire and they also had backup trenches for if they needed to push back.
One question that people might have is why the Battle of the Sommes was one of the deadliest battles. During the battle between July and November 1916, the French and British armies suffered 615,000 casualties and Germany lost 500,000. No man's land is the area that is fully exposed to enemy fire, so it is the most offensive trench warfare. Attacks were unsuccessful and caused a severe amount of casualties. Defenders simply have an extreme advantage against attackers, as the soldiers do not have to charge into no man's land, therefore are not exposed to open fire of artilleries. Defenders also used artillery in order to shoot attacking soldiers who charged through no man's land. Exploding shells fired from heavy artillery killed more soldiers than any other weapon that was involved in the First World War. During the Battle of the Somme, 1.8 million heavy artillery shells were fired at German lines throughout one single week. The Paris gun is an example of a supremely powerful and during the time a well-developed weapon, which was the cause for many deaths. This piece of artillery had an effective firing range of about 130 kilometers. Trench warfare caused numerous unfortunate outcomes and was also a massive cause of many casualties during World War I. People did not value their lives over their loyal attitudes, so the offensive tactics that were involved were a cause of thousands of casualties. Artillery weapons were substantial cannons that had the ability to fire explosives against enemy positions and lines, which caused a lot of damage to man, landscape, and equipment. Heavy artillery became more technologically advanced, so it was used by different empires and colonies in many situations or battles. The developed artillery was more accurate, mobile, and were much more powerful. A tank is a large type of armored fighting vehicle with tracks for transportation. These armored vehicles are specifically designed for extreme frontline combat. Tanks were so powerful in battles during the First World War since it was bulletproof to rifles and machine gun fires. The traditional human wave tactic was practiced by many attacking troops. This tactic was simply based on consecutive human rushes forcefully trying to gain ground by overwhelming the enemy fire with a large quantity of charging soldiers. But this tactic exchanged thousands of lives just to gain a few meters of land.
Who is Sir Douglas Haig? Sir Douglas Haig was Britain's commander-in-chief during the Battle of Somme. He was set in his own ways and planned very traditional tactics. His plans were to attack the Germans that would force them to remove some troops, also relieving France. He believed in the simple advance on infantry troops on enemy lines. He was also called the Butcher of the Sommes because it is said that he sent soldiers to war knowing they would be slaughtered. Does Sir Douglas Haig deserve to be known as the Butcher of the Somme? I believe that Sir Douglas Haig does deserve to be known as the Butcher of the Somme, starting with the fact that he continued to use the same tactic, resulting in 25,000 British men being killed on the first day, with 60,000 British casualties. These are unnecessary deaths that could have been prevented. A quote that Sir Douglas Haig said is, "As long as the Germans lost more men than the Allied would win the war in the end." This is another example that he doesn't care about the lives or the method he is using as long as he wins the war.
In conclusion, the Battle of the Somme is definitely a battle to remember. The first day was the bloodiest day in history for the British Army as they suffered 57,000 casualties. There was no real winner of the battle because after 4 months of fighting, Douglas Haig finally called off the battle, but hundreds of thousands of soldiers had already been killed after advancing only 6 miles. The battle remains one of the most controversial topics of World War I, as many critics believe that British generals did not give their soldiers proper weapons or effective tactics to break through enemy trenches, while others believe that not much could have been done at this time in the war to achieve victory, and that no one is to be blamed for the way the battle